Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash the subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, KJ No. KJ is a political analyst and journalist focusing on the geopolitics and political economy of the Asia Pacific. KJ, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
I wanted to discuss US foreign policy primarily, and we can focus on different aspects of that. But in preparation to this interview discussion, I came across one of the debates that you got involved in regarding China's role in particular to the genocide that is going on in Palestine. And I thought, given we've been covering Palestine for a long time, even before the post October 7 genocide, and we've been also covering China uh, from a positive perspective, given the rise of China has accompanied elimination of absolute poverty for so many people, and given China's rise is a case of anti-imperial alternative to the Western dominance, we have been also covering China a lot. And so I thought if we could start with your take on this conversation about China's role in stopping the genocide. That would be great. How do you frame this discussion, and what would be your apprehension regarding this narrative that China is not doing enough to stop the genocide?
Well, on a fundamental level, I would say that all countries are not doing enough. We are facing a live stream genocide. Children are starving. People are being killed every single day. Journalists are being killed for telling the truth. Parents are being killed for trying to feed their children. Doctors are being killed for trying to save the wounded. And the entire area is in a kind of barbaric medieval siege designed to starve everybody to death, to wipe them out, and now there are further kinetic incursions. So clearly, this is a complete and total genocide. And under those situations, we can argue that nobody is doing enough because this is something that cannot and should not be tolerated. The question that we really have to think about is if we actually care about the Palestinians, what is the thing that is most effective? And we know that there are countries that are directly involved in funding the genocide. There are countries that are directly supplying weapons for the genocide. There are countries that are running cover for the genocide. There are countries that are rejecting any attempt in the UN, in the UNSC to sanction Israel. And we know that there are countries that are actually for whom Israel is the proxy. That literally, this is not here, it's a matter of analysis. If you think that this is an Israeli genocide, you are already off on the wrong track. It is a US genocide for which Israel is the subcontractor, and it has a kind of plausible deniability that the US is trying to, leverage. But this is actually a US imperial genocide. Just look at the history. As the rest of the world was decolonizing, a new settler colonial power was created in Palestine. Okay, this has to do with the larger imperial project of colonization and control of resources in that area. If you think that this is a matter of Israel and Zionism specifically, you're already off on the wrong start. So if we understand that this is a US and Western imperial genocide, then we have to ask the harder question, which is how do we stop Western imperial genocide? And the answer to that is not easy because it has been a continuous stream of genocides. So then we have to ask, do we want to actually help the Palestinians, or are we trying to divert and diffuse blame? Are you trying to diffuse responsibility? We have to ask, what is effective? And if we start to ask the question, what is effective, then we have to look at political responsibility. There are the settler colonial Western powers that are directly involved in the genocide, and those are the targets that you want to go after. If you start expanding the field and saying, third parties are responsible, everybody is responsible, then you've started to diffuse the blame, and you've derailed the kind of concentrated effort that should be applied by the citizens of the global north uh, on their own governments to actually start to do something. We're starting to see large popular movements where people are trying to hold their governments to account. Every organization that I belong to in the United States is taking direct action against our own government. But there's a sector of the synthetic left that wants to divert, and they want to say, look, this is so helpless. It's too big for us. We can't do anything. And then let's blame third parties. This is not political action. This is a kind of psychologizing and catharsis that people are trying to do. Some people are trying to do. It's this kind of disempowerment of necessary action. And it's a way, I believe, of hurting the Palestinians more than they're already hurting. If I wanted to divert responsibility, misdirect blame, and absolve the citizens of the West, and most of the people who are saying these are people who are citizens of the West. If I wanted to absolve myself from holding my own government accountable, this is the kind of argument that I would come up with. And then let's also frame it in the larger context that the US is looking for war against China. That's the link I recently sent you. The US is actively escalating to war against China. And we know that this war is going to go nuclear. There's no way it cannot go nuclear. They're just looking for a casus belli at this point. And immediately as the war starts, it will go nuclear. And so then we're faced with literally a trolley problem, a nuclear trolley problem. It's not that the global south doesn't care, but they know who is holding the leash of the dog that is attacking them, that is attacking Palestine. And they have to find a way to disarm the owner rather than focus on the tail or on the attack dog. It's a misframing or a misunderstanding of what's going on to think that this is an Israeli issue and that all you need to do is do some sanctions against Israel. That's not going to make the difference. You have to stop the weapons, and you have to stop the political support and the political cover that the genocide enabling nations are doing. So I think it's a matter of trying to be effective and really caring about what the issue is rather than trying to, bolster whatever, sense of, trying to disown Western guilt. I think that is one of the key issues.
I want to come to the US preparation of war against China, but just for the context, since we discussed Palestine and we invoke the role that China has played, if we could also tell us a little bit about what China has actually done for Palestine, because China has brought together 14 different factions of the Palestinians resistance movement in Beijing for a summit, and they have considered all of them as part of the resistance, as opposed to the United States, who calls many of them terrorists. Chinese companies like Costco and Okol have also diverged away from trading with Israel. And Chinese investment in Israel actually peaked in 2017, 2018. In the previous decade, China invested about 10 to 11 billion US dollar, but in the last decade, it has been just 2 to 3 billion US dollar. And trade has also peaked with Israel in 2023. A lot of our viewers are not necessarily aware of Chinese actions and what they are doing on a bilateral front. Of course, it's important to emphasize that China can't go over and above international structure and take unilateral approaches to sanctions and everything. So just to sum up this conversation, if you could also place in context what China is actually doing when it comes to its relationship with Israel and Palestine, that would be helpful, I guess.
Well, I think it's important to look at the original history. In 1988, China was one of the first countries to recognize the Palestinian state. And for decades before that, it was an ardent and powerful supporter of the PLO, including, supporting them directly in armed struggle. To this day, China has asserted that the Palestinians have the right to armed resistance. As you point out, they brought together the 14 factions of the Palestinian parties. You cannot you cannot do anything if the internal politics are fractured. So the first step is actually to bring the different parties together, which China has done. We also know that China has provided support to Iran. We know that Chinese companies have provided support to Yemen. In particular, they're using the Beidou targeting system. So these are not uh, uh, insignificant aid. And we also know that the reason why a lot of people started to understand what the Palestinians were really going through is because of TikTok, which is owned by the Chinese parent company. And this is why the Israelis are forcing TikTok, this is why the US is forcing TikTok to be sold because they see TikTok as a challenge to their control over the information sphere, but in particular over Taiwan. So I think there are multiple things that China is doing and has been doing and continues to do under different different things are being done. But let's look at also the issue of Qatar. Just recently, Israel bombed the Palestinian leadership negotiating for peace in Qatar. Okay. And we know that the US greenlighted this because there's no way that Israel could have sent weapons platforms into Qatar, which is essentially a US base. It is, a monarchy that is masquerading as a country that is actually a pretext for the largest US base in the era. They are the two twin evil twins of the Middle East, Israel and Qatar. And they have a nice PR arm. It's called Al Jazeera. And they, lift up the Palestinian issues, but they always focus, as I point out, on the little I, Israel, not the big I, imperialism. And so when Israel bombs Qatar, uh, this is, you can see what the nature of how this setup is. And, what could China have done in that situation? Should it sanction Qatar? Should it sanction the United States? Should it sanction all the other countries that enabled the Israeli attack? These are complex issues. And so the Chinese are trying to navigate carefully in an entire minefield, which is actually being prepared for global war. In fact, I would say that we are already in the first steps of World War III. And as I said, this war is going to go nuclear. I would everything that I see in both doctrine and policy says that this is going to go nuclear. And of course, the current genocidaires are the two nuclear-powered rogue states, the United States and Israel. So we can see that there are tremendous stakes and risks involved. Just to kind of, once again, give the historical context, genocide is nothing new to the Chinese people. During World War II, or from the Chinese standpoint, the Japanese fascist war of aggression against China, they lost 35 million people. That's 8 to 10% of their population. We saw, it started in 1931. And starting 1931, when they invaded Manchuria, they created a slave state called Manchukuo that was driven and run through slave labor. It was essentially millions of Chinese and Koreans held in slave labor camps and worked to death. And this is what built the Japanese industrial war machine that allowed them to, dominate all of Asia. But even then, why didn't the Chinese liberate all the Chinese held in concentration camps? In the Nanjing massacre, 300 Chinese held in a small city and bombed and slaughtered daily, very similar to what the Palestinians are going through right now. Why didn't the, PLA attack the Japanese? Why didn't they liberate their people? You know, these are people who don't understand the larger picture. It's like people who say, Ho Chi Minh was watching a woman being raped, one of his fellow countrymen being raped in front of his eyes in Saigon. And, you can say, why didn't Ho Chi Minh do anything? Well, he did. He did do something. He got rid of the rapists. These were the colonial policemen that were raping them. And he kicked them out of his entire country. But we have to understand that it's not simply about we have to see the larger picture. It's not as simple as simply doing a frontal attack and hoping for the best. You have to understand there's a much, much larger and much, much bigger picture with even greater, believe it or not, even greater stakes than what we are seeing right now in Palestine. We can also see, during the Indonesian genocide, when 1 million, 1.5 million communists were killed. Who were the first people killed during the Indonesian genocide? They were Chinese, right? It started out as a Chinese genocide. Okay. So China is not new to genocide, and it's not new to trying to resist this global hegemonic empire, which is genocidal in intent and practice. But the question is, how can you be effective? What is most effective? And that effectiveness falls back to the citizens of the global north to take actions against their own governments who are directly enabling, supplying the genocide. And then also, uh, being aware that we have to support the global south, which is trying to overthrow this genocidal empire. I think that's, important to understand.
Let's move to the US preparation of war against China. A lot of people might think that given the defeat in imposing tariffs on China, given the defeat of NATO in Ukraine from the Russian special military operation, a lot of people might think that the United States would not think that it can go to a war with China. Uh, why do you think that this policy, sometimes phrased as containing China, Why do you think inside that there is a direct component of not just a war, but a nuclear war inside it?
Well, we know that the United States cannot win a conventional war against China. Certainly not in its own backyard. Or front yard. This is China's front yard. And the US intends to take the war to China, possibly using the proxies of Taiwan, like Ukraine. They're Ukrainizing Taiwan right now as we speak, possibly using the Philippines. Until very recently, I think there was a very, very strong plan to use South Korea because the United States has OPCON over South Korea's 3.6 million troops. These are troops that are ready to go to war immediately. So that was what Yoon Suk-yeol's military coup was about. I believe that that was really about handing over OPCON to the United States under pretense of wartime OPCON, because the coup involved a provocation against North Korea to start a war against North Korea. So we can see everything has been well laid out. And I've been watching this in intensive and granular detail for since the pivot to Asia. It's essentially my beat. It's what I've been watching over thousands of interviews and hundreds of articles. This is what I focus on. And there are people who are saying that, the US is changing angles, it's going to divert back, it's going to retrench into the homeland. But if you look at the language, it's a little bit like when Marco Rubio talks about recognizing multipolarity. What he means by multipolarity is very different from what most the rest of us understand as multipolarity. And the same thing, when the US says, this is a leak in Politico, they say that the national defense strategy, it looks like it wants to focus on the homeland. And then you look at an article right after that in the Stars and Stripes by interviewing General Paparo, and he says the homeland includes the Pacific. In other words, it's like this, it's that old trope. Who lost China? In 1949, the US said, "Who lost China?" As if it was theirs to lose. But it's this notion that the Pacific is a US lake, and Paparo has come out and said it. The Pacific is part of the homeland. So until I see the NDS and I see concrete actions that actually involve disengagement and de-escalation, I am not convinced. I'm not convinced that the US is dialing back. What about the tariffs? What about, the Ukraine war? The Ukraine war is an interesting set of circumstances. We know that starting 2009, after the fall of the global um, financial system, the United States realized that its plan A, which was to absorb China, because China was a Potemkin state like the USSR, was not going to work. And China was not going to collapse. It was actually the West that was collapsing. And so then they decided that they had to take stronger action. And that's when the plan of war was drafted. This is called a doctrine of war called air-sea battle, which is derived from the Soviet era USSR facing battle plan called air-land battle, which actually derives from Israeli war doctrine from the Yom Kippur War. So essentially, we have an Israeli war doctrine of decapitation for China planned since 2009. Those plans have never changed. They've simply been more and more deeply refined. Um, the thing to understand is that not only have these plans not changed, but they've simply morphed and expanded. And originally, when Air Sea Battle was drafted, Air Sea Battle we generally know as Air Land Battle, which is Air Sea Battle, the predecessor to Air Sea Battle. We know Air Land Battle in the colloquial as shock and awe. It was what was used against Iraq and all subsequent countries. It's a plan of shock and awe. So you have to understand the US has planned a doctrine, a war doctrine of shock and awe since about 2009 against China. It wasn't simply a war doctrine because the US believes in full spectrum dominance and hybrid war. And so it also came with a plan of economic warfare. This was what was called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was a plan to isolate China economically and essentially sanction it and weaken it, just that as they had done with Iraq before invading. And then it also had the pivot to Asia, which was diplomatic and everything else it involved encircling China with bases. These different plans simply morphed and multiplied and were rebranded, but essentially there's a visible continuity from that period up to the current moment. And what we see is constant and consistent escalation to war. Why do I think that there is constant escalation to war? When you go to war, there's a kind of a three-step process. The first is information war. Essentially, you demonize the antagonist, and you manufacture consent for war. And in this process of information war, you also want to shut down any opposition to war. So you go after the people who are arguing for peace, you go after the war resistors, etc. We're seeing this right now. The House is going after Code Pink and Answer and all the major anti-war organizations. It's as if, before you send in the infantry, you want to shut down all the air defenses before send in, before you start the war. You want to shut down anything that challenges your control of the information space. You want to have air dominance before you go into war. And before you start the war, you also want to have information dominance. And so we see the kind of escalating information war and the very deliberate and focused attempts for information dominance. That's what we see right now. And the second is what we call shaping the theater. It's when you prepare the region for war by pre-positioning stocks, arms, munitions, by doing military exercises, by moving troops into theater. All of that is already happening, and it's being done over years, and it's constantly escalating. Just one piece, for example, around the military exercises. South Korea had 275 days of military exercises last year. That's unheard of. And during these 275 days, they had 20 nuclear bombing rehearsals, 20 strategic bombing rehearsals. And they were also rehearsing, for example, the capture of POWs, etc. The kind of granular intensity and the pace and the tempo of these war exercises lets you know that these are not ordinary times. These are literally, rehearsal for war. Um, just recently, a few months ago, the US had a live bombing exercise near the demilitarized zone, and they bombed 160 houses. 160 houses were destroyed in bombing. Okay. How did that happen? Well, first, it's a live fire exercise. They're using actual munitions, which again attests to how intense this preparation is. And the second thing is that when you do exercises at the tempo and pace and intensity that actually approaches war, then you are going to get the same kind of errors that you find in war, that is friendly fire incidents. So, this is what happened. But this lets you know, it gives you a taste of what's going on. And then I say, the third signal or the third stage of war is the provocation. So once again, first stage is information war, the second stage is shaping the theater, and the third stage is provocation. You're looking for a casus belli, and we see the provocation happening constantly. It happens in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Straits. It almost happened on the Korean Peninsula. But it's a kind of constant process of provocation. If you play basketball, it's like you drive into the paint over and over and over again, and you try to draw the foul. And then once the foul is drawn, you get everybody in the bleachers to come down, and it's a full melee. But this is the idea. I mean, I'm describing it in a kind of metaphorical way, but this is actually the plan that Elbridge Colby has, documented and written out in his own book that was published a few years ago. And Elbridge Colby, currently, for 10 years since his work at CNAS, has been arguing for nuclear war, in particular, the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And he argues that there should be a seamless continuum between conventional and nuclear war. He says that there just needs to be a seamless continuum. We shift from one to the other as we want. And he's been arguing for this for 10 years now. You can look it up, his testimony to the Senate Arms Committee. And currently he is number 3 at the Pentagon. He is the undersecretary for policy at the Pentagon. Just one more thing to understand. When the United States talks about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and they consider tactical nuclear weapons to be usable, and they consider first strike to be usable, and they consider strategic attacks to be also permissible, first strike strategic attacks. But when the US is talking about tactical nuclear weapons, it is talking about weapons that may have between up to 200 to 300 kilotons. Okay. Well, how powerful is 300 kilotons? The Hiroshima atomic bomb was 15 kilotons. So we're talking about the use of bombs that are 20 to 30 times more powerful, about 20 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The US considers this to be kind of routine, acceptable usage. The problem is it's not going to be acceptable to the counterparty. And so that's the risk that we're facing right now.
One of the things we saw during the first Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was that a lot of other places were turned into battlegrounds and frontiers, and a lot of revolutionary movements, positive, including land reforms, decolonizations, they were either extinguished, killed, or they were attempted to be extinguished in the process, which even when people defended it, a lot of people had to sacrifice. That might be a more likely scenario going forward than, let's say, United States and China fighting a direct battle on Chinese mainland. Um, Comment on that, but also talk about how could the other states. Of course, all these states at the frontiers are differently situated in their relationship to the United States. Some are more client-like, others have a relative more autonomy. I'm thinking about Philippines, was situated in a very dangerous situation. But it also brings in the dimension of Latin America, because that Colby document, which talks about pivoting to Latin America or saving the homeland, which doesn't de-emphasize China at all, by the way. If it does anything, it de-emphasizes Russia and Eurasia. It doesn't de-emphasize China. But that one part of it is also historical US dominance in Latin America, backing dictators, protecting US corporations' interests, etc., etc. But the other dimension is also growing trade and ties between China and Latin America, due to which the US feels threatened. We have seen that in the Panama, with CK Hutchinson being forced out and the BlackRock consortium taking over these two ports. Talk about what can these states, I'm thinking about Korea, I'm thinking about Philippines. Vietnam, of course, is different, but they are directly in line with these frontiers, if you like. What can people, let's say, in these states or in these countries can do to avert the disaster that is brewing?
Well, first, they need to understand their history and they need to understand that, that they should not be pulled into a proxy war on behalf of the United States. Unfortunately, and, this is, the historical precedent, is that so many of them are led by um, Western proxies, Western comprador governments. For example, the vice president of Taiwan is actually a Jersey girl. She was an American citizen who, you know, was a darling of the neocons in Washington. And then she, kind of conveniently discarded a citizen so she could become the vice president. But, the DPP party in Taiwan Island is actually a wholly owned subsidiary of the NED. And, they have their own American vice president from New Jersey. So, I mean, the issue of compradors and comprador governments that are willing to sell out their country and their people is a real issue. And so then that becomes the larger issue of sovereignty. Unless we, unless the global South builds out their own sovereignty, they really do not have a chance. And so then, what does sovereignty look like? Again, it comes back to this discussion I had earlier. If you understand the first domain of war as being information war, this is the pre-kinetic dimension, then what you need is information sovereignty. You need digital sovereignty. The US actually has kind of a digital Wolfowitz doctrine. They believe that they have the right to dominate and have hegemony over the entire digital commons. And what countries need to do, similar to what China has done, is they need to create digital sovereignty that is impervious to Western subversion, just as they need to have, for example, sovereignty over their own land and air and water. This is fundamental. And you can see that, you can see this, kind of battle going on, for example, in Nepal. I mean, Nepal has had terrible politics for a very long time. It has all kinds of contradictions. But the sudden shift in Nepal's, governance happened when the country tried to assert digital sovereignty. That's something that cannot be allowed in the global South. And so they were immediately taken down. People say, well, it's not a color revolution. Those of us who've done activism, who've done, movement building work, know that you don't take down a government in 5 days unless there are some extraordinary, powerful actors acting behind the scenes. And I think that kind of speaks for itself. So, coming back to the key issue, what can countries of the global South do to prevent themselves from being turned into proxy battlegrounds? They need to first build out digital sovereignty, and then they need to build relationships among themselves, much as, for example, the SCO is doing. The SCO is doing that right now. It's really a security alliance between, the key countries of the global South. And it involves, as we saw from the recent SEO summit, it involves first digital sovereignty, including AI sovereignty. The second dimension of it, of course, is geographic sovereignty. Third dimension is financial sovereignty. Unless you have financial sovereignty, you're going to be taken down, bullied, and destroyed economically, and that reduces any capacity to resist, and you'll be overthrown. So they're building out financial sovereignty, in particular, through different clearinghouses and payment settlement mechanisms. And then the fourth dimension, which is related to the other dimensions, is energy sovereignty. So what we saw coming out of the SCO was an ambitious plan for energy sovereignty, in particular, the power of Siberia too, that gives China and other countries in the region tremendous capacity to build out energy sovereignty. So I think sovereignty is the solution to not being used, but it's a difficult struggle. And it's also, as I said, it's an informational ideological struggle. And there are many, many trends, both in the North and the South, that misread the situation and don't understand the importance and value of sovereignty and the value of the countries of the global south working together. They try to flatten the world and say, it's just capitalism, it's just transnational capitalism, and it's just that's the enemy. And if you conceive the world in those terms, this is the kind of Hart and Negri model, which then was translated into the um, that geographer, what's his name? Uh, David
David
Harvey.
Harvey.
Yes. If you subscribe to that model, you're being misled, and your analysis is not going to be helpful. So I think that you start with sovereignty, and especially you support the sovereign socialisms in the global south. You do what you can to support them rather than unilaterally dismissing them the way that the CIA would love you to do. And then you also work, if you're in the global north, to prevent war from happening. War is, as I said, I cannot emphasize this enough. We are on the cusp of global war which will go nuclear. And you do not get a second chance to prevent nuclear war. There are no second chances there. We only have one chance to stop this global war from happening. And so I think there is tremendous responsibility of people, of citizens in the global north to prevent their governments from going to war and committing genocide. Just kind of a big picture analysis. If you look at what China is doing against the United States and the Western empires, it's encircling the cities from the countryside. It's building relationships among all the global South countries, despite the contradictions, despite the problems. It's building connections and then using that as a way of seeing if they can talk sense into the global north, trying to dissuade them from their, extraordinary, agenda of war. And I've analogized this to a game of Go. Others have too. But, in the game of Go or Wei Qi, the goal is connect in order to live. You connect in order to live. And the West often sees geopolitics as a game of chess, the grand chessboard and all that. And in chess, what you do is you position in order to kill. And so they're very, very different games that are being played out. And this is why it looks incongruous and asymmetrical and hard to understand. But the Chinese are connecting in order to live, while the West is positioning in order to kill. We'll see, which one is effective. But right now, the stakes are so high that everybody has a role. They have a duty to do something. And in particular, what they need to do is stop. If you're in the global north, you need to stop your government from escalating to war. And in so doing, you give a chance for the alternate systems, including the sovereign socialisms of the global south, to arise and transform the world, which they are already starting to do. But the plan is to snuff it out, just as Korea was snuffed out in the south. I mean, literally a genocide was committed in Korea even before the war happened. I'm talking about the Porto League massacres. This is very similar to what happened in Indonesia. All the leftists rounded up and shot to death, killed en masse. So many people killed. The world's longest mass grave is in South Korea. It's over a kilometer long. There are 156 unexcavated mass graves. This is the Indonesia, Jakarta type, Jakarta plan that they prototyped in Korea, and then they transferred it to Jakarta. So we know what the stakes are. We know what the empire is capable of. And we also need to understand that whatever small part that we can do to prevent this from accelerating, we actually need to put our shoulders to the wheel and start doing rather than diverting, diffusing, and trying to absolve ourselves.
in so many ways that prototype in Korea again had different prototypes in the Americas themselves, as the United States was founded literally by decimating multiple communities. Um, Maybe KJ, if we could end by discussing or hearing your thoughts about this narrative of or the fact about the decline of the US empire, because quite often than not, I see people from the global north talking about or looking at the decline as a collapse. They look at uh, the dollar downsliding a little bit and say the dollar is collapsing. They see the US getting pushed back in Eurasia and say that the US military is collapsing, or the US withdraws voluntarily from Yemen and they said that's a huge military defeat. And the list is endless. Countries like India refuses to open up its agriculture market to the US subsidized agro market, and some people celebrate it as the defeat of the US economy. um, I don't think there are no elements of truth there, but sometimes I also worry about uh, the negative aspects of the US empire, or I worry about the long continuation of the US empire, even if it is in decline, as worrisome. I'm curious, how do you look at the pace and nature of the decline of the US empire? Do you see this as a collapse, or do you see this as a slow decline, which is refusing to give up its imperial goal and in the process would do um, worse and worse things going forward, and citizens across the global majority have to be very vigilant about it?
Well, the US has been in decline since at least the 1970s. That's why it transitioned to this kind of global neoliberal approach. But capitalism has been moribund for a very, very long time. And it refuses to give up the ghost. And when we say that it refuses to give up the ghost, we know what the reboot mechanism for capitalism is, right? It's war,
Or
right? Yes, it's when, it's like your obese relative who has a heart attack, their heart starts defibrillating. You get the wall defibrillator and you shock them back into life. Well, World War is what is the precedent. This is what they're going to use. And so, yes, the US is declining. The global capitalist imperium is declining. And it is declining slowly and also fast. And it's moving on different tracks, on different areas. It's been deindustrializing since the 1970s. And when we say deindustrializing, it has also been de-skilling. It's been de-skilling its workforce so that it is no longer capable, even if it had the volition and capital to, reindustrialize, it no longer has the skilled workforce that is capable of reindustrializing, doing, industrial work. You ask people if they want to work in factories, nobody wants to work in a factory. When they recently did the raid on the Hyundai factory in Georgia, they had to bring Korean engineers and executives to install all the machinery. And then having arm twisted Hyundai and LG into building a battery factory in Georgia, they raid the factory and they arrest all of the Korean engineers and executives, and put them through ice hell. I mean, it's good that now that the Koreans are telling the story, their side of the story, that we understand that this is what all immigrants are subjected to. But these are the contradictions that are inherent, in a model of capitalism that is of monopoly capital that is not capable of becoming productive. So the contradictions are deep and the decline is continuous and ongoing. The question is, when is the inflection point? That one is hard to tell. We always know that, things happen slowly and then quickly. Are we at the inflection point? Is it the collapse of the dollar? Is it, the various mechanisms of de-dollarization that will push things over the edge? We don't know. But what I do know, and I hate to be so repetitive, is that the US, despite its collapse in all sectors, in education, in industry, in production, all of these factors, it is still strong in two areas. One is the military, and uh, I think it's very foolish to underestimate the power of the U.S. military. And then the second skill, or the second superpower that the US empire has, is marketing. Marketing and information warfare. In fact, the US's great contribution, if we can call it that, to, the if we can call it that, the intellectual history of the world is marketing. It excels in advertising, marketing, and propaganda, and it's so good at it. It's so good at this that it makes people believe that it doesn't do propaganda. It's like Baudelaire said, the devil's greatest accomplishment was making people think that he didn't exist. The greatest coup of American propaganda is making people think that they're not propagandized. So once again, in the synthetic left, they think they're thinking clearly and independently, but they're just repeating the tropes from, Western, state media. And they think that Al Jazeera is something to, look at and to trust. I mean, just look at the Al Jazeera coverage of the Saudi-Pakistan agreement. They removed the critical part in their reporting that it was its distrust of the United States and the attack on Qatar, which has been an accelerant to the Saudi-Pakistan, mutual defense treaty. So, so once again, the propaganda is so powerful and thick, and so that's where it has to be resisted. And we actually have the capacity to resist propaganda because, to the extent that we are critical and independent thinkers, and to the extent that the army, the U.S. military sees mental space as a domain of battle, then your job as an individual is to keep your mental space from being occupied and colonized. And that's something that is difficult, but actually possible to do, with the help of channels like yours and others. So we know where the battle lines are drawn. We know where we are implicated. We know where one of the first places we can resist. And we also have to be mindful of the risks involved in the current moment. As I said before, we don't get a second chance to prevent global nuclear war. And the US is in this school shooter mode. It literally has gone, they would rather destroy the planet than give up their power and privilege. I believe that that is literally true. I think that they also believe that some of them believe that they won't be destroyed. They believe that they can win a war against China, just as they believed that they could win the war against Russia, which was just a gas station masquerading as a country. There are many people who believe this. I call it the grizzly bear fallacy. In the United States, there's about 6% of the adult population that believes that they can defeat a grizzly bear which is probably 10 times their weight and has claws. They believe that they can defeat a grizzly bear with their bare hands. So this is the grizzly bear fallacy, and I believe that it infects the highest levels of US government and policy making and military strategic thinking. I just read an article in the Small Wars Journal. It's a kind of a small, deep state insider journal, which is read by military strategists and policymakers. And they say that we're going to win the Taiwan war, and this is going to be China's Gallipoli. And they give all the reasons why it's going to be like Gallipoli for China. But this is nonsense. Gallipoli is a peninsula. And Ataturk was able to reinforce the defenders and beat off the British and the Anzacs very, very rapidly. But Taiwan is an island. So really, Taiwan is more like a watery Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. Essentially, they are a sitting duck, and it's the Chinese that have the supply lines, and the Taiwanese that don't have the supply lines. It's actually the opposite of Gallipoli, and essentially the plan for Taiwan is the same plan that the French had for Dien Bien Phu. They saw this as a kill box, as a trap into which they would induce the People's Army of Vietnam into a set piece battle and then wipe them out. That was their plan. And they had maneuver planned, and they would bring in French paratroopers, and they were going to decimate the Vietnamese. And they also had, as a backup plan, I think it was called Operation Vulture. The backup plan was to use tactical nuclear weapons. So it's the same kind of insanity and madness. Luckily, at the time, strategic or tactical nuclear weapons were not used, and the French surrendered. It was probably the most humiliating surrender in French military history. And the Vietnamese, became, the Vietnamese were able to assert their independence. But once again, just as the Americans became the successor colonizer to the French in Vietnam, essentially they took over the role over the French. The Americans have been the successor colonizer to the Japanese, in that they rehabilitated the Japanese war criminals. They made some of the war criminals prime ministers. They took the Japanese, medical experimentation team, brought them to the United States and built out Fort Detrick, the U.S. biowarfare lab. And then they took over all of Japan's colonies, in particular Korea, which is a Japanese colony, Taiwan, which had been taken as a Japanese colony in the Sino-Japanese War, and also the Philippines, former Japanese colony, Guam, Wake Islands, etc. All of these former Japanese colonies have been turned into US colonies and US bases. And so, from the Chinese perspective, they look out at that and they think about their 14 years of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggle against the Japanese. And even as they celebrate their 80th anniversary of the victory against the Japanese imperialists, they see the successor imperial state encircling them and directly preparing for war. And so this is, this is once again the dangerous moment. And I believe that, the US is like, the bar drunk. It's like the drunk at the bar. The bar is closing. Your credit card has been rejected. You've struck out with everybody, and, they're flashing the lights. It's time to go home. And the bar drunk does not want to go home. They want to fight, and they're going to fight everybody. And it's that kind of irrational, emotional, clinging, addiction to power. It's like the addict that will not give up their addiction. They'll do anything and anything, and everything to, keep their power. This is the addiction for the United States. This is addiction for the ruling class. It's this addiction to power, this addiction to hegemony, which they will not give up and will not go gently into that good night. And so the challenge for the global South is not to pick a fight. It's not to confront and to directly engage in frontal kinetic conflict, but to see if they can kind of gently de-escalate and gently persuade as a group that the drunk needs to go home and they need to surrender their arms. That's the challenge, and it's a very, very delicate and high stakes one.
Well said. The global south needs to come together and make the point that the drunk needs to go home. I guess this was also one of the things in the Chinese Victory Day celebration, the 88th victory of celebration against the anti-fascist alliance in Asia, and also Japanese imperialism, that was missed in the West, is that it was not just about China. I mean, most of them look at it as display of spectacular Chinese military weapons directed at the United States, but they fail to understand the history that Asia has a long history and experience with colonization, and that resistance was collective. I mean, Vietnam had a long history, and it went far beyond the Second World War as the United States took over. Taiwan had a history of resistance that goes at least as far back to 1895. Korea was divided because of these alternatives to resistance, and the United States never allowed an independent Korea as they took over. And so I guess a lot of people in the West doesn't understand this long history and the collective ethos. But I would also end by saying that there is a lot of amnesia and misunderstanding and propaganda even within Asia and global South about our history. And so we turn a border conflict between excuse me, India and China, and start looking at it from the lens of these grand chessboard, while it is not. I mean, India and China doesn't have these contradictions. India is not militarily dependent on the United States. Of course, we have other reliance. So we have reliance. We don't have digital sovereignty, as you mentioned before. Our elites are also way more hooked into the U.S. Corporate financial sector. So people have been rethinking about these things, but it is foolish to say that the India-China border conflict is part of that larger imperial encirclement. And I think many in Asia, in Philippines, as a former colony of not just Japan but also United States, in India, in Korea, we have to understand about the danger of participating in the shoulders of the drunk, and we need to come together and build an alliance to drive them out. Closing comments from you, KZ, and we'll wrap it up.
You're absolutely correct. So first, the historical amnesia is key. We have to have an anamnesis. We have to remember history because if we don't, we are going down the same garden path. The key thing to understand is after World War II, as the imperial powers, destroyed and weakened themselves, there was a space and an opening for decolonization, national liberation movements. As the West was decolonizing, it didn't decolonize. It simply passed the colonization baton to other countries, such as the United States. It shifted the colonization to neocolonial forms like financialization, which is always the dynamic of imperialism. And then it also left a legacy of divide and conquer. And so it made sure that the countries of the global South, even as they liberated themselves, they would either be still in hock to the West, for example, using the French franc, for example, or they would continue to fight each other. This is the horrific legacy of the colonial project. So the worst example of this is Myanmar. Myanmar, it was an artificial state, cribbed together by the British and still rendered in a non-stop civil war that the British bequeathed it because they were using different groups and different ethnic minorities against each other. And we still see the effects of this. And it's still divide and conquer in Myanmar. Certainly, in the case of China, China was carved up by the Western powers. Concessions were pulled out. The Japanese colonized the north and the Liaodong Peninsula and Taiwan. And so when the British and the West left that part of the country, China has 14 land borders, and every single one of them was a conflict. And the Chinese, there were contestations over the territory with 14 other states. China actually resolved 12 of those 14 conflicts amicably, very often, giving up territory in order to resolve the conflict. The only two countries that are not resolved is India, right? India, and this is, a legacy of the British, the British borders that were created, and the other is Nepal. And so these kind of legacy conflicts that were still simmering are still stoked and used against the countries of the global south to divide and conquer. And so this is what the global south needs to understand, and they need to find a reasonable way of resolving without being pulled into the Western agenda. The other form of divide and conquer, which is less obvious uh, until you look at it from a historical standpoint, is the conflict over sea territory. Now, as the Western colonial powers were ceding land territory, they were increasing their control over sea territory. And this is what the actual UN close United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is all about. If you look at the countries that have the largest ocean territory, they're the colonial states. The country with the largest ocean territory is actually France. France, with the tiny strip along the Mediterranean, that country has the world's largest ocean territory. It's about 11 million square kilometers. And then the second, of course, is the United States. And then you have the other colonial states. These are the key states that have large ocean territories. And then some of the archipelagic states because they're, archipelagic. But what this did was when they increased, the EEZs to 200 kilometers, that ensured that the poorer landlocked states would have overlapping ocean claims, and that they would run into, conflict with each other. And this is what we see most notably in the South China Sea, but elsewhere all over the world. We see how the Western empires, the Western colonial powers, have used the UN close to create vast swaths of control over ocean naval passages and naval strategic points at the same time that it ensures that the poorer countries are going to be in conflict over conflicting ocean territorial claims. And this is completely opposed to the idea of original conception of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was to preserve the oceans as a global commons for everybody. And that was completely undermined. The deliberations have been turned completely secret, but we know that the result was that it supported and empowered the Western colonial powers, just in different ways. So all of this boils down to the fact is that the global South needs to stop subjugating itself and stop uh, buying into this strategy of divide and conquer. And it needs to look for ways for genuine solidarity with each other. I think there are small steps that are being made, but it needs to go much further. Modi's, presence at the SCO summit, for example, was a good start, but it's just the first step. So I think that the global South needs to come together, needs to build genuine solidarity on the basis of equality, which, the Chinese and the other SCO organizations are putting forth. And they need to send the message to the global North that we are strong, we are united, we can resist war and sanctions. And then the duty of the people of the global North is to restrain their governments from escalating to kinetic and nuclear war.
That's a wonderful and insightful note to end on, KJ. Thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful rest of the day ahead.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Take care. Bye.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.